The Valkyrie Dominion had ruled the stars for 12,000 cycles, and in all that time, they had never once known defeat. Their empire stretched across 300 star systems, each one conquered through the same simple method that had worked since the beginning of their expansion into the void. They would arrive with their warships, deliver their ultimatum, and watch as species after species bent their knees and accepted servitude rather than face the terrible weapons of the Dominion commander. Tyshral stood on the bridge of the crushing tide, his four eyes scanning the holographic display that showed the stars ahead. And his mandibles clicked together in a sound that his crew recognized as satisfaction. Crushing Tide was a masterpiece of Valkyrie engineering, a crystalline vessel that seemed to float through space like a beautiful and deadly predator, its hull shimmering with energy shields that could withstand the fire of 100 lesser ships. Visceral had commanded this vessel for nearly 200 cycles, and in that time, he had brought 17 species into the Dominion's fold. Some had fought back, of course, but their resistance had always been brief and futile. The Valkyrie possessed weapons that could crack planets and technology that lesser species could not even begin to understand. And Tyshral had used both without hesitation whenever it was required. Now he had received new orders from the High Council, orders that seemed almost beneath his dignity and the dignity of his magnificent ship. A new species had been detected in a distant arm of the galaxy, emerging from a small yellow star that the Dominion scouts had been watching for several cycles. These creatures called themselves humans, and the reports that Tyshral had read about them were almost amusing in how unimpressive. They were soft-bodied beings with fragile skin and weak bones, lacking any natural weapons like claws or venomous fangs. They lived short lives, barely 100 cycles at most, and they had only recently discovered how to travel faster than light. The High Council had decided that these humans were not worth the effort of a full invasion fleet, so they had sent Tyshral alone to handle the matter. His mission was simple: travel to the human home system, deliver the standard ultimatum, and bring another species into the Dominion service. It was almost insulting to be given such an easy task. But Tyshral understood the wisdom of the Council's decision. Why waste resources on a species that posed no threat? His second-in-command, a younger Valkyrie named Cresphalum, approached him with a data tablet clutched in her clawed hands. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the proper tone of respect, "we will arrive at the target system within the next cycle, and I have prepared the standard submission broadcast for your approval." Tyshral took the tablet and glanced at its contents. Seeing the familiar words that had been spoken to so many species before, the message was simple and direct. Surrender all territory. Submit to genetic cataloging, provide workers for Dominion projects, and accept your new role as a servitor species. Refuse, and face complete extinction. The translation is accurate? Tyshral asked, and Cresphalum nodded quickly. Our linguistic specialists have been studying their radio transmissions for several cycles, she explained, and they are confident that the humans will understand our demands perfectly. Tyshral handed the tablet back and turned his attention to the stars once more. "What do we know about their military capabilities?" he asked, though he expected the answer to be as unimpressive as everything else about this species. Cresphalum consulted her tablet before responding. "Their weapons technology is primitive by our standards, Commander, and they appear to rely heavily on chemical propellants and crude nuclear devices." She paused, and her mandibles twitched in what might have been amusement. They have also been engaged in several conflicts among themselves, fighting wars over resources and territory and ideological differences. This caught Tyshral's attention, and he turned to look at his second-in-command with renewed interest. "They fight among themselves?" he asked, and Cresphalum confirmed this with a gesture of affirmation. "Constantly, Commander, and their history appears to be one long record of warfare and violence, with brief periods of peace scattered between their many conflicts. Taishral considered this information and found it both surprising and reassuring. Most species that reached the stars had long ago abandoned internal warfare, recognizing that cooperation was necessary for survival in the vast emptiness of space. A species that still fought among themselves was clearly primitive and undisciplined. Easy prey for the organized might of the Dominion. They will submit quickly, Taishral declared, his confidence growing with every piece of information he received. And if they do not, we will make an example of one of their worlds to show them the futility of resistance. He had done this before, selecting a populated planet and reducing it to molten slag while the rest of the species watched in horror. It was brutal but effective, and it saved time in the long run. The bridge crew went about their duties with the casual efficiency of veterans who had performed this same mission many times before. There was no tension in the air, no sense of danger or excitement. This was simply another job, another primitive species to be conquered, another world to be added to the Dominions. Collection Taishral settled into his command chair and allowed himself to imagine the commendation he would receive when he returned with humanity's surrender. Perhaps the Council would finally grant him command of a battle group, multiple ships under his authority, a position worthy of his experience and skill. The crushing tide slid through the darkness between stars, its engines humming with power, its weapon systems dormant but ready to be awakened at a moment's notice. In the distance, the yellow star that the humans called Sol grew brighter against the black canvas of space. Taishral watched it approach and felt nothing but contempt for the creatures that orbited that unremarkable sun. They had no idea what was coming. For them, they had no idea that their brief moment of freedom among the stars was about to. And then they certainly had no idea that Commander Taishral of the Velthari Dominion considered their entire species to be nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a small task to be completed before moving on to more important matters. The commander's mandibles clicked together once more, and he allowed himself a rare moment of amusement at the thought of the terror these humans would feel when they saw his magnificent ship appear in their sky soon. Very soon, they would learn their place in the galaxy. They would learn to bow before their new masters. They would learn, as so many species before them had learned, that resistance against the Dominion was not just futile, but unthinkable. Taishral closed his secondary eyes and waited, patient and confident, as his ship carried him toward what he believed would be the easiest conquest of his long and distinguished career. The crushing tide emerged from faster than light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and immediately the sensor officer began scanning the space around them. Taishral rose from his command chair and studied the holographic display that materialized before him, showing the layout of this small and unremarkable star system. There were 8 planets orbiting the yellow sun, along with countless smaller bodies of ice and rock scattered throughout the outer regions. The third planet from the star was the one that interested him most, a blue and green world that the humans called Earth, their home and the center of their tiny civilization. Scan complete, Commander, the sensor officer reported, his voice calm and professional, and I am detecting multiple human settlements throughout the system. The display updated to show small markers indicating human presence on several moons and planets, as well as stations floating in the void between worlds. Taishral studied this information with mild interest, noting that the humans had spread further than he had expected for such a young species. Their expansion rate is impressive, Cressvolume observed from her position beside him, and they appear to have colonized more territory in a few generations than most species manage in 1,000 cycles. Taishral dismissed this with a wave of his clawed hand. Expansion without power is meaningless, he said, and all their colonies will belong to the Dominion soon enough. He was about to order the ship to proceed toward Earth when the sensor officer made a sound of confusion, a clicking of mandibles that indicated something unexpected. "Commander," the officer said slowly, "I am detecting a vessel approaching our position from behind the 8th planet." Tyshrol turned his attention to the display and saw a single marker moving toward them, emerging from the shadow of the large ice giant that the humans called Neptune. "Just one ship?" Crestfalum asked, and there was amusement in her voice. "It appears so," the sensor officer confirmed, "though I am having some difficulty getting accurate readings." Tyshrol watched the marker approach and felt a flicker of annoyance at this minor complication. He had hoped to reach Earth without any delays. But apparently, the humans intended to meet him here at the edge of their system. It was a foolish decision, sending a single vessel to face a Velthari warship. But Tyshrol supposed he should not expect wisdom from such a primitive species. "Can you identify the vessel?" he asked. And the sensor officer worked his console for several moments before responding, "I am attempting to resolve the image now, Commander, but there seems to be some interference." The display flickered and shifted as the sensor systems struggled to provide clear data. And Tyshrol felt his annoyance. Growing Velthari technology was supposed to be the finest in the galaxy. Yet here was his sensor officer struggling to scan a single human ship. "What is the problem?" Tyshrol demanded, and the sensor officer shook his head in obvious bewilderment. "I do not understand it, Commander, because the mass readings I am receiving cannot be correct." Before Tyshrol could respond, the human vessel cleared the shadow of the ice giant and became visible on the main display. Every member of the bridge crew fell silent. Tyshrol felt his 4 eyes widen as he stared at the image before him, his mandibles frozen in a position of shock that he had not experienced in centuries. The human ship was enormous. No, enormous was not the right word, because the Velthari language did not have a word adequate to describe what Tyshrol was seeing. The vessel that approached them was a mountain of metal and fury, a brutal construction of angular plates and massive gun batteries that seemed to have been designed by beings who had never heard of elegance or efficiency, where the crushing tide was sleek and beautiful. This human ship was ugly and terrifying, covered in scars and burns and welded patches that spoke of battles survived and enemies destroyed. It was at least 12 times the mass of his own vessel, and its hull bristled with weapons that Tyshrol could not even begin to identify. "That cannot be real," Crestfalum whispered beside him, her voice carrying a tone of disbelief that Tyshrol had never heard from her before. The sensor officer was working frantically at his console, running scan after scan, but the results remained the same. "The readings are accurate, Commander," he reported, and his voice trembled slightly. "And the vessel's power output is beyond anything in our database." Tyshrol forced himself to remain calm. Though his hearts were beating faster than they had in many cycles, he was a veteran of 17 conquests, a commander who had faced resistance from species far more advanced than these humans were supposed to be. There had to be an explanation for this. Perhaps it was a trick, some kind of holographic projection designed to intimidate potential invaders. But even as he thought this, he knew it was not true. The sensor readings were clear, and the mass of that ship was creating gravitational distortions that could not be faked. "Magnify the image," Tyshrol ordered, and the display zoomed in on the approaching vessel. Now he could see details that made his blood run cold. The hull was covered in markings and symbols, some of which appeared to be kill counts, recording destroyed enemy ships. There were painted images of predatory creatures with open jaws, and words in the human language that the translation software rendered as battle cries and warnings. And there, painted across the front of the ship in letters large enough to be seen from space, was a name. UNS Thermopolythesor did not know what that word meant, but something about it sent a chill through his body. It sounded like a word from ancient history, a word connected to war and death and defiance. "Commander," the sensor officer said quietly, I am detecting active weapon systems on the human vessel, and they appear to be powering up. Tyshrol stared at the approaching ship and realized that his assumptions about this mission had been catastrophically wrong. The humans were not a primitive species to be easily conquered. They had built this thing, this monstrous battleship, that made his own vessel look like a child's toy, and they had sent it here, alone, to meet him, not to negotiate, not to surrender, but to fight. Tyshrol thought about all the reports he had read, all the intelligence that the Dominion had gathered about humanity, and he wondered how they had missed something this important. How had the scouts failed to report that the humans possessed ships like this? How had the analysts concluded that this species was primitive and weak? The Thermopylae continued its approach, moving with the slow and deliberate pace of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. And for the first time in his long career, Commander Tyshrol of the Veltri Dominion felt something that he had only ever seen in the eyes of the species he conquered. He felt fear. The bridge of the crushing tide had become a place of tense silence as every crew member stared at the human battleship that now dominated their display screens. Thais. Ral forced himself to think clearly despite the fear that was clawing at his mind, and he began issuing orders in a voice that he hoped sounded more confident than he felt. Tactical analysis, he commanded. And I want every piece of information you can gather about that ship's weapons and defenses. The tactical officer bent over his console and worked with desperate speed, his clawed hands moving across the controls as he tried to make sense of what the sensors were showing him. Commander, he said after several tense moments, the human vessel is carrying weapon systems that I cannot fully identify. He brought up detailed scans on the main display, highlighting different sections of the enemy ship. These appeared to be kinetic accelerators of a design we have never encountered before, capable of launching projectiles at speeds that would punch through our shields with ease. Tyshrol felt his mandibles tighten as the tactical officer continued his grim report. There are also missile batteries along the flanks, hundreds of them, and deep scans suggest that each missile carries a nuclear warhead far more powerful than anything in our own arsenal. Crashful stepped closer to the display, her eyes fixed on a section near the center of the human ship. What is that? She asked, pointing at a strange energy signature that pulsed like a heartbeat in the core of the vessel. The tactical officer shook his head slowly. I do not know, he admitted, but the power readings suggest it might be a contained fusion reaction of incredible intensity. He paused, and his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. Commander, if that thing is what I think it is, they could use it as a weapon capable of destroying everything within 1,000 kilometers. Tyshrol absorbed this information and felt the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a physical force. Had come here expecting to conquer a primitive species with crude technology. Instead, he found himself facing a war machine that outclassed his own vessel in every possible way. But it was not just the ships. Weapons that disturbed him was the ship's behavior. Thermopylae had stopped moving. It now sat motionless in the void between Neptune and the inner system, positioned directly in the path that any invader would have to take to reach Earth. The human vessel made no attempt to flee or hide or call for reinforcements. It simply waited, like a guardian standing at the gates of a fortress, daring anyone to try and pass Tyshrol. Had seen many reactions from species facing Veltri warships over his long career. He had seen panic and desperation. He had seen futile attempts at negotiation. He had seen ships scatter and run in the hope that some might escape, but he had never seen this. He had never seen a single ship position itself between the Thais Dominion and its target and simply refuse to move. There was something deeply unsettling about that stillness, that absolute confidence. It spoke of a species that did not fear death. It spoke of a species that had faced threats before and destroyed them. It spoke of a species that considered this confrontation not a crisis, but an opportunity. "Commander," the communications officer said suddenly, "we are receiving a transmission from the human vessel." Tyshrol straightened his posture and prepared himself to hear whatever demands or pleas the humans would make. Perhaps they would offer to negotiate, perhaps they would ask for terms, perhaps there was still a way to salvage this mission without combat. "Play it," he ordered, and the bridge speakers crackled to life with a human voice. The voice was flat and calm, completely devoid of the fear or desperation that Tyshrol had expected, spoken simple, direct words that the translation software rendered perfectly. "You are in restricted space," the voice said, "and you have 60 seconds to withdraw." There was a brief pause, and then the voice continued with words that would echo in Tyshrol's memory for the rest of his life. "There will be no second warning." The transmission ended. That was all. No demands for surrender, no offers of negotiation, no questions about Velthari intentions or requests for dialogue, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the casual certainty of a species that had already decided how this encounter would end. The bridge crew looked at each other with expressions of shock and confusion, unable to comprehend what they had just heard. In all the history of the Dominion, no species had ever spoken to a Velthari warship in such a manner. "They cannot be serious," Cresfaloom said. Though her voice carried doubt rather than conviction, the tactical officer cleared his throat nervously. "Commander, the human ship's targeting systems have just locked onto us, and I am detecting energy buildup in their weapon batteries." Tyshrol stared at the display and watched as small points of light appeared across the hull of the Thermopylae, each one representing a weapon system preparing to fire. There were hundreds of them, thousands of them. Human Battleship was lighting up like a star going nova, and every single weapon was pointed directly at the crushing tide. "They're not bluffing," Tyshrol said quietly, and he realized that his voice was shaking. He looked at the countdown timer on his display and watched the seconds tick away. 50 seconds, 40 seconds, 30 seconds. His crew waited for orders, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that their commander would find a way out of this situation. But Tyshrol was frozen. He was frozen because he was staring at the human ship and seeing something that terrified him more than all its weapons combined. The Thermopylae was not alone. Deep scans were now detecting more signatures further in the system. Dozens of ships of various sizes clustered around Earth and its moon, and construction facilities that dwarfed anything the Dominion possessed. The humans had not sent their entire fleet to face him. They had sent one ship, because that was all they thought they would need. 20 seconds. Tyshrol looked at his weapons officer and considered ordering an attack. Perhaps the crushing tide could strike first and destroy the human vessel before it could respond. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was foolish. His ship was outgunned and outmatched, and even if by some miracle they managed to destroy the Thermopylae, there were dozens more human vessels waiting to avenge their fallen comrade. 10 seconds. Tyshrol made his decision. He said, and his voice came out as barely more than a croak. "Reverse course." The crew stared at him in disbelief, but he did not wait for them to question his order. "Now," he shouted, and the helm officer's hands moved to obey. The crushing tide began to turn, its engines firing as it prepared to flee from a battle it could not win. And through the viewport, Tyshrol watched the human battleship sitting motionless in the void, its weapons still locked on his retreating vessel. Watching him run with what he could only imagine was cold satisfaction. The mighty Velthari Dominion, conquerors of 300 star systems, had just been turned away by a single ship, and Tyshrol knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The crushing tide moved slowly toward the edge of the Sol system, its engines running at minimum power as if afraid that any sudden movement might provoke the human vessel that still watched them from. Ban Fisherall sat alone in his private quarters, surrounded by holographic displays that showed everything the Dominion had ever gathered about the human species. Had been studying this information for hours now, reading every report and watching every recording, and with each new piece of data, his understanding of the situation grew darker. He had made a terrible mistake, not just in coming here with a single ship, but in assuming that humanity was like every other species the Dominion had encountered. The reports had mentioned that humans fought among themselves, and Fisherall had interpreted this as a sign of weakness and barbarism now. As he read deeper into their history, he realized how wrong that interpretation had been. The humans had been waging war against each other for their entire existence. Their earliest recorded histories spoke of battles and conquests, and every generation had known conflict of some kind. They had invented weapons of mass destruction and used them against their own kind, killing millions in single conflicts that lasted years. Any other species would have destroyed itself long ago. Any other species would have used such weapons to bring about its own extinction, burning itself out in a final catastrophic war before it could ever reach the stars. But the humans had not destroyed themselves. They had survived. Not only had they survived, but they had thrived. Each war had taught them something new about combat and strategy, and the terrible art of killing. Each conflict had driven them to build better weapons, stronger defenses, and more resilient societies. They had taken the horror of their violent nature and transformed it into a tool for survival. Fisherall found a recording of a human speech given by one of their historical leaders, a male who had guided his nation through one of their great wars. The translation software rendered his words clearly, and Fisherall listened with growing unease. "We shall fight on the beaches," the human leader said, his voice carrying a fierce determination that made Fisherall's blood run cold. "We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills." The speech continued, listing place after place where the humans would make their stand against their enemies. And it ended with a simple declaration: "We shall never surrender." Fisherall turned off the recording and sat in silence for a long moment. He had never heard such words from any species. Every civilization the Dominion had conquered had eventually chosen to surrender rather than face extinction. It was the logical choice, the rational choice, the choice that any thinking being would make when faced with overwhelming force. But the humans did not think that way. Their history showed that they would fight long past the point of reason, long past the point where victory was possible. Simply because surrender was not in their nature, they would burn their own cities rather than let them fall into enemy. Hence, they would sacrifice millions of their own people. Rather than accept defeat, they would continue fighting even when all hope was gone. Driven by something that the Valtteri did not possess, HFY found another file in the database. This one containing human sayings and phrases that their linguistic specialists had collected. He scrolled through them, searching for insight into the human mind. And one phrase caught his attention: "If you want peace, prepare for war." He read those words again and again, trying to understand the mindset that had created them. The humans knew that peace was only possible through strength. They understood that the galaxy was a dangerous place, filled with threats that would destroy them if given the chance. And so they had built that terrible ship, that iron monster waiting in the void, not because they were afraid, but because they were ready. They had prepared for war so thoroughly that war had become their natural state, the default condition from which all other activities proceeded. Another phrase appeared on his display, and this one struck Fisherall like a physical blow. "We have met the enemy, and he is us." The humans knew what they were. They understood their own capacity for violence and destruction, and they had accepted it. They did not pretend to be peaceful creatures, Forced into conflict by circumstance, they acknowledged that the violence was part of them, woven into their very nature, and they had learned to direct that violence outward toward any who threatened them. Thishel thought about the Thermopylae and its crew, the humans who had sat in that massive battleship and watched the crushing tide approach without showing any fear. What kind of beings could face a Veltari warship with such calm confidence? The answer was now clear: beings who had spent their entire existence fighting against themselves, who had survived wars that would have destroyed any other species, who had clawed their way to the stars through blood and fire and sheer stubborn refusal to die. The humans were not afraid of the Dominion because they had already faced the most dangerous enemy in the pristine galaxy. They had faced themselves, and they had. One Thishel closed his eyes and thought about what this meant. For the future, the Dominion had encountered many species over 12,000 cycles of expansion, but they had never encountered anything like humanity. Most civilizations became peaceful as they advanced, setting aside warfare as a primitive relic of their past. But the humans had done the opposite. They had advanced while keeping their warrior nature intact, growing more powerful without growing less dangerous. They had turned their violent instincts into an advantage, building ships and weapons that reflected their fundamental understanding of conflict. Thermopylae was not just a warship, it was a statement. It was a message written in metal and fire, saying to anyone who approached, "We are humanity, and we are ready for ya." Thishel opened his eyes and looked at the display, showing the Sol system growing smaller behind them. Somewhere back there, the human battleship was still watching, still waiting, its weapons still ready to destroy anything that threatened its home. And deeper in the system, around that blue and green world called Earth, there were more ships, more weapons, more humans, millions of them, billions of them, whole species of warriors, looking up at the stars and wondering what challenges awaited them. Thishel realized that the Dominion had been incredibly fortunate if they had sent a full invasion fleet instead of a single ship. If they had attacked without first understanding what they were facing, the result would have been catastrophic. The humans would have destroyed them, and then the humans would have wondered who else might be out there, who else might threaten their home, who else might need to be eliminated. Before they could strike again, the Dominion had nearly awakened a sleeping predator. They had nearly given humanity a reason to look beyond their borders and begin expanding, not for exploration or resources, but for war, for conquest, for the same reasons that the Dominion itself had expanded 12,000 cycles ago. And Thishel knew with absolute certainty that if humanity ever decided to become conquerors, there would be no force in the galaxy capable of stopping them. His hands trembled as he began composing his report to the High Council. Future of the Dominion might depend on whether they listened to his warning. The crushing tide reached the edge of the Sol system and prepared to jump back into faster-than-light travel, leaving behind the yellow star and the terrifying species that called it home. Thishel stood on the bridge one final time, looking at the display that showed the distant glow of the human sun, and he felt a strange mixture of relief and shame. Relief that he was escaping with his ship and crew intact, shame that he was running from a battle, something no Veltari commander had done in thousands of cycles. Gresham approached him carefully, her movements hesitant, as if she was unsure how to address a commander who had just ordered a retreat. "The crew is confused," she said quietly, "and some of them are angry." Thishel nodded slowly without taking his eyes from the display. "Let them be angry," he replied, "because anger is better than death." He turned to face his second-in-command and saw the questions in her eyes. "You saw that ship," he continued, "and you saw its weapons, and you know as well as I do that we would not have survived that fight." Cressvaloon was silent for a moment before speaking again. "But Commander, we are the Veltari Dominion, and we have never retreated from any species. Then perhaps it is time we learned a new lesson, Tyshrol said. And his voice carried a weight that made Cressvaloom step back. I have spent hours studying the humans, reading their history and trying to understand what they are. And I have come to a conclusion that the High Council must hear. He moved to the central command console and began entering the codes that would transmit his report directly to the council chambers on the Dominion homeworld. What conclusion? Cressvaloom asked. Thishrol paused and looked at her with his 4 eyes carrying an expression she had never seen on his face before. The humans are not prey, he said, and they are not rivals. And they are not even enemies in the way we understand. The word, he gestured toward the distant sun on the display. They are something we have never encountered in 12,000 cycles and expansion across the galaxy. What are they? Cressvaloom Whisperedishal took a deep breath before answering. They are survivors of themselves. He turned back to the console and continued, entering his report. Every other species we have conquered became peaceful before they reached the stars, setting aside their violent past as they matured and developed. His claws moved across the controls as he spoke, but the humans did not follow that path, and instead they carried their violence with them, forging it into ships and weapons and a military doctrine that assumes conflict is not an exception but a constant. The report was almost complete now, and Tyshrol chose his final words carefully. They have spent their entire existence at war, fighting against each other with weapons that grew more destructive with each generation. He shook his head slowly. Any other species would have been destroyed by such violence. But the humans survived, and they learned. And they became something that I believe the galaxy has never seen before. The last section of the report appeared on the screen, and Tyshrol began dictating his recommendations. Do not engage humanity in combat, he said, and the console recorded his words. Because they will not surrender, and they will not stop fighting until one side or the other has been completely destroyed. Cressvaloom listened in stunned silence as her commander continued. Do not threaten them, because threats will only convince them that we are an enemy to be eliminated before we can strike. Tyshrol's voice grew harder as he spoke the next words. Do not give them a reason to look beyond their borders and wonder what other threats might exist in the galaxy. Because if they decide to expand their territory through conquest rather than exploration, nothing will stop them. He paused and took a moment to compose his final recommendation. I urge the High Council to consider the unthinkable, he said. And I recommend that the Velthari Dominion adopt a policy of complete non-interference with humanity. Cressvaloom made a sound of shock at this suggestion. You want us to leave them alone? She asked in disbelief. To treat them as equals? Not as equals, Tyshrol replied, but as a species that poses a unique and unprecedented threat to the Dominion's continued existence. He finished entering his report and transmitted it to the homeworld, knowing that the Council would receive it within a few cycles. I want us to leave them alone, because it is the only way to ensure our survival. The transmission complete. Tyshrol turned away from the console and walked toward the viewport. Order the helm to begin the jump, he said to Cressvaloom, and take us home, as the Crushing Tide's engines powered up for the journey back to Dominion space. Tyshrol stood at the viewport and watched the Sol system one last time. Somewhere in that system, billions of humans were going about their daily lives, unaware of how close they had come to war with an alien empire. They would continue building their ships and training their soldiers, preparing for conflicts that might never come, driven by instincts that had been forged over thousands of years of constant warfare. And somewhere in that system, the Thermopylae was returning to its patrol, its crew satisfied that they had successfully defended their home against a potential threat. Those humans had no idea how significant this day had, but they had no idea that their mere existence had forced the commander of the mighty Velthari Dominion to turn and run. They had no idea that their ship, which they probably considered just one vessel among many, had just changed the course of galactic history. The jump engines activated and the stars stretched into lines of light as the crushing tide accelerated beyond normal space. Feist. Ral closed his eyes and thought about the report he had sent, wondering if the High Council would listen to his warning. He hoped they would. Hoped they would understand that some species were not meant to be conquered, that some battles were not worth fighting, that some enemies were too dangerous to provoke. The humans called their system Sol after their star, but Tyshrol had another name for it now, a name that he would use in all his future reports and discussions. He called it the Warning, a warning to any who might think that the galaxy was theirs for the taking, a warning that somewhere among the stars there existed a species that had been forged in the fires of perpetual war, a warning that humanity was watching, waiting, and ready. Years later, when historians wrote about this moment, they would mark it as the day the Dominion's expansion finally stopped. They would write about how a single Veltari warship had entered human space and fled without firing a shot. They would analyze Tyshrol's report and debate whether his conclusions had been correct, but they would all agree on one thing: the humans had done something that no other species in 12,000 cycles had managed to accomplish. They had made the mighty Veltari Dominion afraid, and in doing so, they had secured their place among the stars, not as servants or subjects, but as something far more significant. They had secured their place as the predators that even predators feared. The crushing tide vanished into the void between stars, carrying its crew back to safety and leaving the Sol system behind. And in the silence that followed, the yellow sun continued to shine on the blue and green world where humanity lived and worked and dreamed of the future, a future that would belong to them alone, a future that no one in the galaxy would dare to threaten again.